Welcome back to the second part of shareholders' equity. The learning objectives for this part are first, account for distributions to owners, and second, accounting for recapitalization and quasi-reorganization. Let us first define what retained earning is. So it represents the cumulative balance of profits and losses after distribution of dividends to shareholders. In simple terms, ito yung cumulative balance ng profits and losses in the prior periods after distribution of dividends. So, sabi sa retained earnings, kapag meron siyang negative balance, ang tawag sa kanya ay deficit. So, what are the components of retained earnings? Those are first, beginning balance. Second is profits, which is yung nagpapa-increase sa retained earnings. And third, on the other hand, is the losses, which is yung nagpapa-decrease naman sa retained earnings. And lastly, yung dividends. So, total retained earnings may consist of first, unappropriated, and second is appropriated. Yung unappropriated, ito yung unrestricted portion ng retained earnings. Meaning, ito yung pwedeng i-divide ng corporation or ibigay as dividends sa mga shareholders. Sa appropriated naman, ito yung restricted portion ng retained earnings. Restricted, kaya bawal siyang ipamigay as dividends. So, appropriation may be a result of the following. First is legal requirement, second is contractual requirement, third is voluntary requirement. So, sa legal requirement, ito yung required by law, appropriations na required ng law. For example is appropriation for treasury shares and appropriation for quasi-reorganization. Sa appropriation for treasury shares, ang sabi sa corporation code, kapag may treasury shares, dapat mag-appropriate ka rin ng same amount of the cost of your treasury shares sa retained earnings mo. Hindi pwedeng mag-acquire ng treasury shares kung insufficient yung retained earnings. So, dito naman sa contractual requirement, by the term contractual, meaning appropriations required by third-party agreements. An example would be banks. Pag sinabi ng bangko na dapat mag-appropriate ang company ng certain amount sa retained earnings, that is what we call a contractual requirement. So, as an example, appropriation for compliance with agreements with third parties. Last is voluntary. It is a category of appropriation according to the will of the board of directors. Kung gusto mong mag-appropriate or kung gusto ng board of directors na mag-appropriate, that is what we call voluntary. For example, appropriation for plant expansion. So ngayon, lahat ng appropriations na nagfo-fall under these categories, lahat sila restricted. Hindi siya pwedeng ipang-declare ng dividends. Next is accounting for appropriation. So, how do we account appropriation? First is establishment of appropriation. Kapag nag-establish ng appropriation, kailangan natin siyang tanggalin kay retained earnings account. Ililipat natin or i-reclassify natin sa tinatawag na retained earnings appropriated for blank, kung para saan. Next, pag natapos na yung objective ng appropriation, i-release na siya from restriction or appropriation. Ang entry for that, babalik na rin lang yung establishment. This time, aalisin na siya as appropriated retained earnings. Ililipat na siya sa general retained earnings account. Appropriation is disclosed in notes. Take note of that. Let's now move on with the computation of total shareholders' equity. So, dito, share capital plus subscribed share capital plus share premium is equals to the total contributed or paid in capital. And then, retained earnings, kapag ka naman deficit, negative siya. Next is the other comprehensive income. Ito yung items ng income and expenses na hindi na-report under profit or loss. And last is ile-less natin yung treasury shares. So, that is how we get the total shareholders' equity. Next is dividends. So, dito, yung source ng dividend can either be earnings or contributed capital. We can categorize dividends into two, and those are dividends out of earnings and dividends out of capital. Kapag dividends out of earnings, ang source niya would be unappropriated retained earnings. The dividends out of earnings can be classified as cash dividends, property dividends, and share dividends. It will be further discussed later. So, sa dividends out of capital, ang source niya is contributed capital and classified lang siya as liquidating dividends. For share basis for dividends naman, to compute for that, number of shares issued plus number of shares subscribed plus number of share dividends distributable less number of shares in the treasury. And that totals the number of outstanding shares. Next, meron tayong relevant dates for accounting dividends, and those are date of declaration, date of record, and date of distribution. So, sa date of declaration, nag-a-announce na yung board of directors na magbibigay sila or magdi-distribute sila ng dividends. Sa date of record naman, ito yung date kung kailan nagre-record yung corporate secretary ng mga pangalan ng shareholder na entitled makareceive ng dividends. For the last one, date of distribution, dito na yung actually babayaran yung mga dividends. So, for recognition of dividends, kailan nga ba sila nare-recognize? It is recognized at date of declaration. Date of declaration and not on the date of settlement. Next is accounting for cash dividends. Let us first define what cash dividend is. So, ito yung most common type ng dividend. Ito rin yung dividend in the form of cash. So, ngayon, ito yung journal entries at date of declaration, date of record, at date of distribution. Sa date of declaration, debit retained earnings and credit dividends payable. Sa date of record naman, walang entry dahil nga dito pa lang yung binibigay or sinasabi yung pangalan kung sino-sino yung makaka-receive ng dividends. Sa date of distribution naman, debit dividends payable and credit cash. Next is accounting for property dividends. Kanina, di ba, cash dividend in the form of cash siya. Ngayon naman, dito sa property dividend in the form of non-cash assets. So, property dividends is also known as dividends in kind. Dito, merong accounting issues. Una, measurement of property dividends payable. And second, measurement of the non-cash asset to be distributed as property dividend. Sa unang issue, what would be the measure of property dividends payable? The answer is at fair value of non-cash asset. But it is to be adjusted until settled kasi paiba-iba ang value ng non-cash asset. Sa pangalawa naman, it must be the lower of the carrying amount at date of declaration and fair value less cost to distribute at the date of declaration din. So next, i-assess natin yung asset if it is impaired or not. So paano natin malalaman? If the carrying amount is lower, yung assessment natin doon is no impairment. But if the fair value less cost to distribute is lower, then there is impairment. So to better understand the measurement of non-cash asset, here is an example. So makikita natin sa case 1, carrying amount is equals to 100 and then fair value less cost to distribute is equals to 102. So paano ngayon natin makukuha yung measurement of non-cash asset held for distribution? So ang ilalagay natin dito, whichever is lower. So kita natin mas mababa yung carrying amount kaya yun yung ilalagay natin. Ngayon, may impairment loss ba? Wala. Bakit? Dahil mas mababa yung carrying amount. Katulad ng sinabi natin kanina, kapag mas mababa yung carrying amount, walang impairment loss. ngayon, dito naman sa case 2 kabaligtaran. Mas mababa naman yung fair value less cost to distribute, kaya rin siya yung nirecord natin as measurement of non-cash asset held for distribution. Ngayon, kapag mas mababa yung fair value less cost to distribute, magkakaroon ngayon ng impairment loss. So, the impairment loss is computed through subtracting the fair value less cost to distribute sa ating carrying amount. So, tandaan natin na nag-a-arise lang ang impairment loss kapag mas mababa yung fair value less cost to distribute. Share dividends payable. These are the dividends paid in the form of shares naman. Merong 2 types nito. Una is yung own. Dito sa own, ito yung shares na nanggaling mismo sa isang corporation. And yung other entity naman, nanggaling sa ibang corporation yung share. So, share dividends payable, hindi siya isang liability kasi yung share dividends payable is a transfer of retained earnings or yung pagdidistribute ng share ng isang corporation sa mga shareholder. So, merong 2 types ng share dividend payable. So, una is yung small dividends and the other one is the large dividends. Sa small dividends, there is less than 20% of outstanding share and it is recognized at fair value or par value and it arises from share premium. Sa large dividends naman, it has more than 20% of outstanding share and it is recognized at par value only and hindi siya nag-a-arise sa share premium. So here is an example. Dito sa illustration na to, there is large dividends kasi yung declaration of outstanding share is 20%. Kaya sa journal entry, date of declaration on December 30, 2015, debit retained earnings of 200,000 and credit share dividends payable of 200,000. On the date of distribution, on January 31, 2016, debit share dividends payable of 200,000 and then credit share capital of 200,000. So, note that when it is a large dividend, there will be no share premium. So, for the second illustration, it shows an example of small dividend because the declaration of outstanding share is less than 20%. Dahil dito sa example, 10% lang, kaya small dividend siya. So, in journalizing, on the date of declaration on December 30, 2015, debit retained earning of 500,000 and then credit share dividends payable of 100,000 and credit share premium of 400,000. On the date of distribution on January 31, 2016, share dividends payable is debited at 100,000 pesos and debit share capital of 100,000 as well. So, katulad ng sinabi ko kanina, small dividend siya kasi yung declaration ng outstanding share ay less than 20% lang. Let us now move on with quasi-reorganization. So, eto naman, yung mga companies na nag-undergo dito is yung mga naghihirap na or may problema financially. So, bakit nila kailangan mag-undergo ng quasi-reorganization? Yung main reason is dahil yung deficit nila ay napakalaki na. Masyado nung masakit sa mata para sa mga investors para maging attractive pa rin naman yung shareholders equity portion ng company. So, they have to undergo quasi-reorganization. So, the objective of quasi-reorganization is to eliminate deficit. Ngayon, ang tanong, pwede bang anytime mag-undergo sila ng quasi-reorganization? The answer is no, dahil kailangan pa nilang humingi ng permission sa Securities and Exchange Commission. So, quasi-reorganization may be accomplished through first, recapitalization, and second is revaluation. So, ang recapitalization, ang mangyayari dyan is gagamitin na account para ma-wipe out yung deficit ay yung share premium. Pero, pagdating sa revaluation, ang account na gagamitin ay revaluation surplus. Ang revaluation surplus, yan yung ginagamit sa PPE under revaluation model. So, revaluation surplus is an OCI item, which is also a component of shareholders' equity.
So here's our illustrative problem under recapitalization. Answer the following. Number 1, how much is the amount of the deficit to be wiped out? Number 2, immediately after the quasi-reorganization, what is the balance of the share premium account? Number 3, immediately after the quasi-reorganization, what is the balance of retained earnings account? Number 4, immediately after the quasi-reorganization, what is the total shareholders' equity? So, ang una muna natin gagawin ay journal entries. So, bullet 1, yun yung nakikita niyo sa problem kanina. So, ang journal entries na bullet 1, debit retained earnings for 100,000, credit inventory for 100,000. Bullet 2, retained earnings 600,000, credit PPE 600,000. So, bullet 3, share capital, paano nakuha yung 3 million? 2,000 shares times 150. So, credit share premium 3 million. So, solution for number 1. So, dito sa number 1, hinahanap lang natin or inaalam lang natin kung magkano ang amount ng deficit na i-wipe out natin. So, that should be the adjusted deficit. So, magkano yung deficit prior to quasi-reorganization or the unadjusted deficit is 4,700,000. Mag-e-effect yung mga adjustment natin. So, sa retained earnings, ilan ulit yung adjustments natin kanina? 2. Number 1 is inventory at yung isa ay si PP. So, magkano ang adjusted deficits? 5,700,000. So, dito, may journal entries siya. So, debit, share premium, 5,700,000. Credit, retained earnings, 5,700,000. So, solution for number 2. Dito sa number 2, tinatanong tayo if magkano yung share premium after quasi-reorganization. So, let's start with the balance of the share premium prior to quasi-reorganization. Magkano daw siya kanina? 3.3 million. Next, ang reduction in par value ay papasok na siya sa share premium, therefore ma-add up siya. So, magkano na siya ngayon? 6,300,000. E, ginamit natin siya to wipe out the deficit. So, magkano yung win-wipe out natin? 5,700,000. So, magkano na lang share premium? That is 600,000. So, solution for number 3. Dito sa number 3, inaano lang kung magkano yung retained earnings after the quasi-reorganization. Answer is 0. Automatically 0? Yes. In all cases ba yun? Yes. So, in quasi-reorganization, pag tinatanong kayo kung magkano yung retained earnings after quasi-reorganization, 0 na yun. Kaya, wag na kayong magsayang na mag-compute kasi 0 na talaga siya. So, dito sa number 4, ang nahanap lang natin, total of shareholders equity after quasi-reorganization. In this case, tatlo lang yung nakikita natin dito. Yun yung share capital, share premium, and retained earnings. So, magkano ang share capital after reorganization? So, meron dito solution kung paano siya nakuha. So, ito ay 7 million. So, next is share premium after quasi-reorganization. Ito yung compute natin kanina, which is 600,000. So, next is retained earnings after quasi-reorganization. Katulad ng sabi natin kanina, 0 siya. So, ngayon, magkano ang total shareholders equity after quasi-reorganization? That is 7,600,000. So, that's it for our illustrative problem deals with recapitalization.